I am ready to help some investors today figure out how to actually build some wealth by building a rental portfolio versus getting stuck in kind of the big bank conventional loan maze, my friend.
I know we ran into this the other day. We were sitting across a real estate investor. They had a couple properties. They all are cash flowing. They've got 800 credit, money in the bank, and they just found their fourth one, and the numbers all check out. And unfortunately, their lender said something to them that you and I really couldn't believe. Today, we're going to be talking about DSCR. This is the easiest program for investors to utilize to buy and build their rental portfolios. This is for your experienced investors and your first-time investors looking to buy their first property. So a couple things we're going to qualify today are the paperwork needed, the amount of down payments required, and the actual requirements of the loan. DSCR, debt service coverage ratio. And so what that means is that if the property rents out for, let's call it $3,000, your mortgage needs to be $3,000 or less to be able to cover that mortgage payment or be cash flowing. So that most lenders want a 1-to-1 ratio so that the debt is paid and repaid, is fulfilled and repaid, and so that they're going to make their money on the interest, you're going to get a cash flowing property. So the biggest thing with that is we don't use your personal income. As long as the rental of the actual property checks out, we just need to verify deposits and you're able to move on with your loan and keep acquiring those properties.
Wait a minute. You're telling me that people don't have to qualify off their personal income. Is that what you just said?
They do not have to qualify off their personal income. So that client that you had that made almost $1 million a year can write off as much as he can within the business to save on his taxes and still utilize that money to be able to buy rental properties, have those appreciating for him, and having his tenants pay down the mortgage for him.
I'm just going to show this here to everybody. So you used an example and you said if the monthly payment came out, or the monthly rent, if that property could rent for $3,000 total, if the payment, let's say, came in at $2,500, now maybe it'll come in even less, but let's say it's $2,500. That is more. Your actual rent that you can bring in is actually more than 1%, or it's more than 100%. And so on the debt service coverage ratio, we typically, as you said, Kel, investors typically want a 1.0 ratio or better a lot of times. Now, if you're dealing with banks or some of those big, those big mortgage lenders around the country that have offices everywhere, they have big shiny showrooms, and I call them showrooms, but reception areas and stuff like that, they might be a little more conservative and say, we want to see a 1.15% or 115%, or maybe even 1.25. Something, Kellum, we actually have investors or lenders that we can actually go down to 0.85%. So we can actually go below, for experienced investors, below the actual rental amount if they qualify. There's some credit qualifying and some things like that. But we don't have to be at 1.0, and I think that's really cool. Everybody, I mentioned, I had a client last year. Now, this particular investor, Kellum, he actually owned his home that he lived in. So he had to pivot. He was trying to buy a new home that he was going to move into. He was going to take his existing house that he owned and turn that into a rental property. Okay? This is really important because what this particular client did is he ended up and decided he just put a little, maybe a little remodeling into the house that he was in. He kind of spruced up the kitchen a little bit. And then what he decided to do is buy a new house using the DSCR. I explained it to him and said, here's how it works. And this client, from August through the end of the year, has purchased 3 homes, and I've been able to help him get into 3 homes because after he purchased the first one in August, you know what he said, Kel?
This is so cool. Let's do it again.
How long do I have to wait to do it again? And I said, you can do another one immediately. And so he's literally bought 3 properties from August through the end of the year using a DSCR. All we have to do is he has to credit qualify, and then we have to prove that the rents are going to exceed and how do we do that, Kel? That's important for people that are listening because it kind of seems too good to be true. How do we determine what the rent will be when somebody's buying an investment property?
Absolutely. Well, now stop me if I go too far down the mortgage jargon train, but I'm going to have to toe the line a little bit.
All right, go ahead.
What we do when an individual buys their primary residence, we order an appraisal. That's considered a 1003 appraisal. Now, For rental properties, there's an additional section. It's called a 1007, and that form shows what the market rents would be for properties or like properties in the area to be able to justify what that rent amount is. Like you said for your example, so if they were going to rent it out for $3,000, but market rents on that 1007 are $3,200, then you're going to have a really good deal. So you would be able to use the $3,000 or the $3,200 based upon what you needed to qualify for the particular deal.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, now a question that we get asked all the time. And so for a listener that might be thinking about buying an investment property, or maybe you already own some investment properties. And quite honestly, Cal, I'm surprised at how many investors, that only have a couple of rentals don't know about the DSCR yet. But can they pick the appraiser? Because a lot of investors, know somebody in the industry. Are they allowed to choose their appraiser?
We are not able to choose the appraiser. So we have to go through an AMC or an appraisal management company, in which case, depending upon the area, we select an appraiser, it's sent out through an order, and someone accepts it, and they go out and appraise the property based off of the 1003 and 1007. But we are not able to choose our good buddy Bob to go out to the property and say, oh, it's only going to be $2,500, but I think you could rent it for about $3,500. Yeah. Sorry, Bob, we're not going to be able to do something like that.
Yeah, we'd be blowing a technical foul on that one. So, okay, so we get an appraisal. So the appraiser goes out and tells us as the lender how much the property is valued at, just like a normal transaction, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. Next, on the appraisal, they do an additional schedule called a 1007, which as a consumer, if you're buying properties, you don't need to remember that. Just know in the back of your mind we've shared. So that 1007 or additional schedule is what shows us as the lender what the rents are for the area. Correct? Am I following?
That is correct, 100%.
Okay. And so then after your down payment, right? You buy a house for $300,000. You put, let's say, 20% down, which we're going to get to down payment, but let's just talk about, they put 20% down. Now they have a mortgage, what is that? 20% is what, 60? So 240. They have a $240,000 mortgage. And so they finance that. So the payment with taxes and insurance has to come in. We'd like to see it at or a little or below whatever the rent schedules will evidence for bringing in rent. Is that correct?
That's what we would go off of. Yes, sir.
Okay. Makes total sense. All right. And so here's the cool thing. Sometimes, and again, you heard me say it earlier, and I know you were doing a little work with a couple of investors here in the last couple of weeks, that they actually fell below their actual mortgage payment was a little higher than what they could bring in rent. And was that a dead deal, or what did we do? We were able to what? Were we able to put that together?
We were able to put that together.
Nice.
So
yeah. Now it's not every day, guys. And so again, the more experienced you are as an investor, we have different investors that we can go to, for some of those unique things when the monthly payment may exceed the rent schedules by a certain amount. So we can look at those things, but it's pretty cool. Can you share with everybody, you just recently had another investor that you're working with, and I know they're from out of town. We're not going to use anybody's names. We might call them like Charlie or Pete or something, but kind of share what that scenario was and how you're able to help that client, because this is important when people get to hear real life examples, how this can help them, I believe.
Absolutely. So this particular individual lives in the Midwest. And so he lives in a city where high-rise apartments or skyscraper living is very, very common within the city. And so he doesn't own a primary residence, but he's in the sales world, makes a good amount of money, and owns some high-level assets that are not property. But as lenders, when we look at that, he's never had interest in a property before or a structure. And so that makes it very difficult for what we would call first-time investors if they've had no interest in a property. So for those of you who own or are living in a primary residence, this doesn't apply to you. But for some of those people out there that live in metropolitan areas that it's easier to rent in a high-rise, or you want to live downtown, there are some certain hoops you have to go through. So this is something we learned. But if you are a first-time investor that does not have interest in a property, it is very difficult to get in for your first one just because you have no history of managing some debt like that. Even if you may have other assets of high value, lender guidelines are a little strict in that regard.
Right. So, Kellum, one of the big questions that I get all the time from real estate agents and investors, or really not even investors, people that would like to maybe buy their first investment property, is how much money do I need for a down payment? Because there's all kind of myths out there of 25, 30, 40% down. So break it down for us. What is the down payment requirements on a DSCR? What's the minimum that we can do as far as a down payment, all the way up to what do we normally see?
Right. And the minimum is not as much as you think. It's about 15%. Now, investments are not one size fits all. There's different scenarios. So we typically say 15 to 25%, depending upon the property, the area, if there's any minor things that are specific to that deal. But typically an investor can balance or budget for about 15 to 25%. They're obviously welcome to put down more, but investors want to stay liquid so that they can keep acquiring more and more properties.
Okay, so let's break that down though real quick. So we've got somebody that's a first-time investor. They've never owned a rental property before. Would they be able to take advantage of a 15% down payment, or is that only for a more seasoned investor who's got, a couple of investment properties already in their portfolio?
15 is going to be for your more experienced investors. Now, it is going to typically come with a little bit higher interest rate. So there's always this give and take back and forward. If you're going to put down less money, there's going to be a slightly higher rate. It's a little bit riskier to the investor or the lender. So typically that's why we see that 15 to 25%. For your first time investor, you're definitely going to be 20, 25. And if they're not the highest quality investor, they may be pushing 30.
Okay, makes sense. And recently, I just was pricing one out with one of my clients the other day, and he was exploring 20 versus 25% down, and that interest rate difference, he was able to get about a half to 5/8 of a percent difference, better rate by putting an additional 5% down. So this particular investor, although he's seasoned, he likes to stay in that 20 to 25 so that he can maximize and get the best rate. So great information. I like how we broke that down. I think that'll be helpful for listeners today. So good job.
Coach Dave, it's time for our 2-minute drill. We've got to wrap up the show.
Man, it went quick. Holy crap. All right, let's go.
So I've got a note here after we've shown people how to get into the property through a DSCR loan. What about our investors who already have them? How do they get money or access to their asset that they've now purchased? How do they utilize it?
Oh, great question. Okay, I'm going to be quick. We're in the 2-minute drill. So here's the deal. So DSCR, debt service coverage ratio, they love refinances. And guys, one of the things we didn't have a chance to mention, this is considered more of a commercial loan, but it's in your personal name. And so you can actually take title in a business name if you want to. So again, we can talk about that offline, but here's the deal. A lot of investors, as their properties will appreciate, they'll do what we call a cash out refinance up to a certain what we call loan level or loan to value. So keep numbers real simple. I just closed a loan in the last couple of weeks, appraised value, it was a fourplex, okay? Fourplex. It appraised for $550,000, had a borrower that had about a 680 credit score. We were able to pull 65% of the equity out of the property. So the house appraised for around $550,000. We were able to do a loan for $385,000 for this borrower. Now, this particular borrower had depleted all their funds, used all their cash to buy the property, renovate it, and they needed that cash. Cool thing is they got $385,000 loan. They got all that cash. This person actually texted me this morning and said, I now have 2 additional properties that I've got my eye on. Can you send me over a pre-approval? So they're looking at taking possibly 20% down payment to utilize to buy one of those other properties utilizing a new DSCR loan. So that's how they do it, Kel. They pull out the cash and use that to leverage to go buy additional doors that then create additional monthly rent cash flow. There you go.
I love it. Rinse and repeat. Buy,
Rinse and repeat.
Cash out, buy more. Thank you all. Please like, comment, subscribe, share with somebody who would love this info or would appreciate the knowledge, and we will see you next week. Bye.